Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes grabbed her arm and shoved her back from the hangar door. "I said, back off, lady. You do not belong here." She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with eyes that had already seen things he would never survive. And Hayes had no idea he had just put his hands on the woman who had brought a dying fighter jet home through enemy fire alone, with a wounded man bleeding in the seat behind her. Before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end. Because what happens next on that flight line will stay with you for the rest of your life. The heat came off the tarmac in waves. It was the kind of desert morning that made everything shimmery. Parked aircraft, the fuel trucks idling near the far end of the runway, the controls tower standing tall above everything like a concrete sentinel watching over a world that never truly slept. Red Valley Air Base had been awake since before dawn. There was always something moving at a military airfield, ground crews pulling maintenance, security teams running their rotations, pilots walking from the briefing room to their aircraft with that particular kind of focused silence that people who have never been to war would not understand. Nobody was expecting what walked through the outer perimeter gate that morning. Or rather, nobody saw her coming until she was already there. The woman who stepped onto the flight line did not look like a warrior. She did not look like a decorated officer. She did not look like someone who had just 18 hours before made decisions in a cockpit at 40,000 feet that most trained military pilots would not have survived. She looked like someone who had been through something terrible. Her clothes were not hers. Someone had given her a plain gray shirt 2 sizes too large and a pair of dark utility pants that bunched at the ankles. Her boots were scuffed in the kind of way that spoke of violence, not ordinary wear. The left side of her face carried a bruise that had moved from red to deep purple overnight. Her hands, both of them, showed the pale tremble of someone whose body was still in survival mode, even though the danger was hours behind her. Her name was Captain Emily Carter, and she walked like she still had a mission to finish. There was no escort with her, no officer accompanying her through a secured military zone, no badge clipped to her collar, no ID card visible, nothing that said officially that she had any right to be on that flight line. She had walked away from the medical wing before the doctors had finished with her. She had not answered the intelligence officer who had knocked on her door at 0530 hours. She had not returned the call from Colonel Reynolds, who had tried to reach her twice before the sun fully rose. She had one direction in her mind: Hangar 4, the place where her aircraft had been rolled after landing. The F-15E Strike Eagle with the tail number 880412. The machine that should have been dead in hostile airspace and wasn't because she had refused to let it die. She crossed the main apron without stopping, moving past a group of 3 maintenance airmen who looked at her with open confusion. One of them almost said something. He opened his mouth, glanced at the bruise on her face, and then quietly let her pass. Something about the way she walked made certain questions feel wrong to ask. She was about 40 meters from Hangar 4 when Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes stepped into her path. Hayes was 26 years old. He had been at Red Valley for 14 months. He was sharp, attentive, and very good at his job, which on this particular morning meant standing post at the entrance to the restricted hangar section and ensuring that nobody without proper authorization crossed that line. He had the kind of confidence that came from knowing the rules and knowing that the rules existed for a reason. "Stop right there, ma'am." Emily did not stop. Not immediately. She slowed slightly, the way a person slows when they hear their name called, in a crowded room, registering the interruption but not changing direction. Hayes stepped directly in front of her. "Ma'am, I need you to stop. This is a restricted area." Now she stopped. She looked at him. Just looked at him with those eyes that had not slept and had seen things that even now were replaying behind them in ways she could not control. She did not look angry. She did not look dismissive. She looked, if anything, very tired and very certain. "My aircraft is in that hangar," she said. Her voice was calm. Not soft calm. The difference mattered. Soft is uncertain. Calm is something that has moved past uncertainty into a place where only purpose remains. Hayes studied her. He was trained to read people. He was trained to spot threats, to identify behavioral patterns, to distinguish between someone who was lost and someone who was dangerous. And what he was seeing did not add up. A woman in civilian clothes, no ID, no escort, a bruised face claiming ownership of a combat aircraft. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into the tone of someone about to repeat something they consider final, "I need to see your identification." "I don't have it," Emily said. "You don't have it?" "No. And you're claiming that one of our aircraft in a secured, restricted hangar belongs to you." "I'm not claiming anything," she said. "I'm telling you, my aircraft is inside. I need to see it." Hayes straightened. He was not a cruel man. He was not even an unkind one, but he had a job, and the job had rules, and the rules existed precisely because unauthorized people standing at the entrance to a hangar full of classified military aircraft was not a small problem. "Ma'am, without identification, without an escort, and without prior authorization, I cannot allow you to enter this area. I'm going to need you to come with me to the security desk where we can—" "I'm not going to the security desk." Hayes paused. The conversation had just shifted. "Excuse me." "I heard you, NIGHTHAWK," Emily said. "I'm telling you, I'm not going. Not right now. I need to see that aircraft first." Hayes straightened even more. He was a full head taller than her. He had the build of someone who took physical fitness seriously as required. He was wearing his full security kit, and the woman standing in front of him in borrowed clothes with trembling hands was telling him no. "Ma'am, I'm not asking. This is a direct order from base security. You need to leave this area immediately or I will be required to physically escort you. Don't." One word. Hayes stopped mid-sentence because the word hadn't been said with panic. It hadn't been said with aggression. It had been said with the specific, quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what would happen next if he reached for her. And Hayes, despite himself, felt something shift in the back of his mind. He reached for her arm anyway. The next 4 seconds happened very fast. Emily did not hit him. She did not fight. She did not even raise her voice. What she did was move with the kind of efficiency that is not learned in a gym, but trained into the body over years of survival conditioning. And suddenly, Hayes found himself off balance. His grip broken, standing 2 feet further back than he intended, staring at a woman who had not even changed her expression. She had not hurt him. She had simply made it clear without a single unnecessary motion that hurting him was something she was capable of doing and had chosen not to do. The 2 maintenance airmen who had been walking past froze completely. A flight crew 20 meters away had stopped and turned to look. Nobody said anything. Hayes stood there with the sudden, strange awareness that he had made some kind of significant error in judgment, though he could not yet name exactly what it was. And then the radio on his shoulder crackled, the voice of the tower controller sharp and clear through the static. "Post 7, stand down immediately." Hayes grabbed his radio. "Tower, I have an unauthorized individual at the entrance to Hangar 4. She's refusing to comply with—" The controller cut him off. "Post 7, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That is not an unauthorized individual." Hayes looked at Emily. She had not moved. She was still standing in the same place watching him with those exhausted, clear eyes. "Tower, she has no identification, no escort." "Sergeant Hayes." The controller's voice changed. It became quieter, and somehow because of that, far more serious. "You are currently obstructing the pilot of aircraft tail number 880412. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" The number landed somewhere in Hayes' chest. 880412. He had heard that number this morning. He had heard it the moment he came on shift, when the overnight crew was talking quietly near the security desk, when the maintenance chief had come through with a face that said something significant had happened. 880412 was the aircraft that had come back last night, with damage that should have meant it never came back at all. "Post 7, the controller said, and now there was something in the voice that was not command, but something older and more human. "NIGHTHAWK has the line." For a moment, nothing moved on the flight line. Not Hayes, not the maintenance airmen, not the 2 pilots who had stopped near their aircraft 30 meters away and were now standing very still looking at the woman in borrowed clothes standing at the entrance to Hangar 4, NIGHTHAWK. Hayes knew the name. Everyone at Red Valley knew the name. It had circulated through the base the way important things circulate, not through official announcements, not through memos, but through the specific urgent quiet of people telling each other something they cannot quite believe but know to be true. NIGHTHAWK was the pilot who had taken a missile hit over restricted airspace and did not eject. NIGHTHAWK was the pilot who had kept a catastrophically damaged aircraft airborne through judgment, instinct, and sheer refusal. Nighthawk was the pilot who had brought that aircraft home with a wounded weapons officer alive in the rear seat when every calculation said both of them should have been dead in the desert. Hayes had imagined Nighthawk many times. He had imagined the walk, the posture, the bearing, some version of a warrior that matched the stories. He had not imagined this. A woman with a bruised face and trembling hands and borrowed clothes standing in the early morning heat, asking quietly to see her aircraft. He stepped aside. He did not do it because the radio told him to. He did it because somewhere in the last 40 seconds, the understanding of exactly who he had been blocking had arrived not with a crash, but with the slow, certain weight of something true settling into place. Emily Carter walked past him without looking back. She walked through the entrance to Hangar 4, and she did not stop until she saw it. The aircraft. The F-15 E-Strike Eagle with the tail number 880-412 looked like something that had survived a war, which was precisely what it had done. The forward section of the fuselage was scorched in long, dark stripes, where the heat of the engine explosion had traveled against the frame. The right side showed the burn marks of a secondary detonation, the kind that happens when a system pushes past failure into something worse. The leading edges of the wings were pitted with debris impact. The right horizontal stabilizer was partially missing, sheared away by the same force that had taken the right engine. The cockpit was intact. That was the thing that caught in Emily's throat. The cockpit was intact. She had known it was intact because she had been in it. She had felt the pressure differential when the seal was compromised. She had managed the systems manually when the automated responses failed. She had flown the aircraft through the last portion of hostile airspace using a combination of dead reckoning, radio silence, and a level of concentration that had by the end felt like the only thing in the world that existed. But seeing it now standing outside it was different. Standing outside it, she could see what it looked like from the outside. She could see what Ryan had been inside. Captain Ryan Brooks, her weapons systems officer, the man who sat in the rear seat, the man who had been her partner in the cockpit for 3 years, who knew her decisions before she made them, who had trusted her with his life in the way that only people who have been in real danger together can truly trust each other. Ryan was in the hospital. He had been airlifted directly on landing, his injuries requiring immediate attention. The burns on his hands, the impact trauma to his left shoulder, the hearing damage from the explosion proximity that would take months, possibly longer, to understand the full extent of. Emily had not gone to the hospital before coming here. She had come here first. And standing in front of the cockpit of 880412, with investigators moving quietly around the rest of the aircraft and engineers making notes on their tablets, and uniformed personnel standing at respectful distances, Emily Carter put her hand against the side of the aircraft, just flat against the scarred metal, and stood there. She did not make a sound. She did not move for a long time. Major Jason Miller watched her from near the hangar door. Miller was 34 years old, a senior pilot with enough flight hours to fill a very thick logbook, a reputation for being unimpressed by most things, and a genuinely excellent combat record that he wore lightly, the way men sometimes do when they have actually seen what the alternative looks like. He had come into the hangar because someone had told him Nighthawk was there. He had expected he could not later explain exactly what he had expected, except that it was not this. He watched the woman with the bruised face stand with her hand against the scarred fuselage. He watched the stillness of it. He watched the way nobody in the hangar made any attempt to approach her, not the investigators, not the engineers, not the security personnel who had now gathered near the entrance, with their confusion converted into something quieter. He understood then, looking at that stillness, something that the stories had not conveyed. The stories had talked about the mission, the damage, the return, the statistics of what the aircraft should and should not have been capable of. The stories had not talked about what it costs to hold something together for that long, what it takes out of a person to refuse again and again at every moment when the instruments are screaming and the systems are failing and the rational calculation says stop, to refuse to stop. Miller had never met Captain Emily Carter before this morning. He thought, looking at her, that he understood for the first time why some call signs are not given, they are recognized. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Hayes stood at the hangar entrance. Hayes was processing something that would take him a long time to fully articulate. The gap between what he had seen and what was true. The woman he had grabbed. The assessment he had made certain, trained, confident, and the complete failure of that assessment in the face of reality. His hand still felt faintly the moment she had broken his grip. Not broken it with force, broken it with something he could not name, something that had no sound and no weight, but had simply dissolved his certainty in the space of a second. He thought about the word he had used, unauthorized. He thought about how sure he had been. He had told her she did not belong here. He had put his hands on her to remove her from a place that was in the most fundamental possible sense hers. Hayes was not a man given to excessive self-criticism. He was pragmatic. He followed procedure. He trusted his training. But standing there in the entrance to Hangar 4, watching the pilot of 880412 stand in the quiet of her own survival, he felt the weight of something he had not expected to carry today. He had been wrong, not just wrong about the identification, wrong about what he saw, wrong about what it meant. And he could not go back and unsee the moment she moved, could not unlearn the second in which everything he assumed was simply and completely dismantled. Inside the hangar, Emily finally moved. She moved toward the cockpit access ladder that the maintenance crew had placed beside the aircraft. She climbed it slowly, carefully, because her ribs were damaged and the movement cost her, and she settled into the front seat. The front seat was hers. The back seat was Ryan's. She sat in her seat and she looked at his. The back seat of an F-15E is where the weapons systems officer sits responsible for the systems, the targeting, the communications, the navigation, the management of all the complexity that a single pilot cannot handle alone. It is where Ryan had been during the mission. It is where he had been when the missile hit. It is where he had been when she made the decision that changed everything. The decision not to eject. In a catastrophically damaged combat aircraft, the standard procedure, the correct procedure, the procedure she had been trained on and certified in and had never once questioned before, was to eject, to get out, to preserve pilot life when the aircraft cannot be preserved. She had not done that. She had calculated in the fraction of a second that the calculation required that Ryan's ejection seat was compromised, that ejecting him into hostile airspace wounded with a damaged system at that altitude and trajectory would not save him, that the only chance he had was if she flew the aircraft home. She had been right, but sitting in that cockpit now looking at his empty seat, she did not feel like someone who had been right. She felt like someone who had made a decision for another human being at the worst possible moment and then had to live with it, not the outcome which had worked, but the decision itself which had been hers and hers alone. There was a sound from below the aircraft. "Captain Carter." She looked down. Colonel David Reynolds was standing at the base of the access ladder. Reynolds was the base commander, a man she had briefed twice and never spoken with informally, a man whose voice she associated with official communication and not much else. He was a tall, careful man in his early 50s with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless he chose to give it. He was not in his formal uniform. He was wearing his flight suit. He had come to the hangar from the operations building. She guessed the same building where they had been trying to reach her all morning. "Sir," she said. "You should be in the medical wing," he said. "I know. The doctors are." "I know, sir." Reynolds looked at her for a moment. He was quiet the way that senior officers sometimes are, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are choosing precisely what needs to be said and what does not. "Ryan is stable," he said. Emily's breath caught. She had been told when they landed that Ryan was alive. But stable was different. Stable meant the immediate crisis had passed. Stable meant the worst moment was over. "His hands are going to need additional surgery," Reynolds continued. "The shoulder is more complicated than they initially assessed. The hearing they don't know yet. But he is stable, and he was asking for you at 0400. Emily said nothing. Reynolds looked at the aircraft. He looked at it for a long time in a way that Emily recognized. It was the way pilots look at aircraft when they are thinking about what it means, not mechanically, not technically, but in the larger sense, in the sense of what it represents, what it carried. "I've been flying for 27 years, Reynolds said. "I have seen damaged aircraft. I have seen battle damage reports. I have read every account of every significant incident that has come through this base in the time I've commanded it." He paused. "I have never seen anything like this." Emily looked at the instrument panel in front of her, the screens that had gone dark, the controls that had felt different under her hands as systems failed one by one, the throttle that had given her less and less to work with as the right engine lost function, and the secondary systems tried to compensate for what they were never designed to compensate for. I wasn't going to leave him, she said. I know, Reynolds said. If the seat had been functional, she stopped. She started again. If there had been a way to safely, Carter. Reynolds' voice was quiet. I know. She looked down at him. He was looking up at her without the expression of a commander assessing a subordinate's decision. He was looking up at her with the expression of someone who understood personally what it meant to make a choice in the air that no training exercise ever fully prepares you for. The investigation is going to find exactly what I expect it to find, he said, which is that every decision you made was the correct decision given the circumstances. That is not why I came down here. Why did you come down here, sir? Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Because when I was 29 years old, he said, I landed a damaged aircraft alone on a base I had never been to, and for 3 hours afterward, all I wanted was to sit in the cockpit. He paused. Nobody let me. 3 commanders pulled me out within 10 minutes. He looked at the aircraft again. I always thought that was a mistake. Emily looked at him. For the first time since she had walked onto the flight line, something shifted in her face. Not breaking, not the way she had in the quiet of the cockpit when she had first looked at Ryan's seat. Something smaller. Something that was simply the recognition of being understood. I'll report to the medical wing in an hour, she said. 2, Reynolds said. He walked away. And Emily Carter sat in the cockpit of Aircraft 80412 in a hangar full of people who had stopped pretending to do other things in the early morning heat of a desert air base where less than 12 hours ago the unthinkable had come home. At the hangar entrance, Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes stood very still. He had heard every word. He thought about the hand he had put on her arm. He thought about what he had said, how sure he had been. He thought about the fact that this woman in borrowed clothes with trembling hands and a bruised face had brought a dying aircraft home through enemy fire to save a man's life, and then before she had slept or eaten or let anyone treat her injuries, had walked back to see it, not to prove anything, not to be seen, just to be there, just to face what she had survived. Hayes had processed a lot of things in his career, a lot of incidents, a lot of moments where the situation was not what he initially assessed. That was part of the job. The job required you to be right quickly with incomplete information. He had been wrong today. He had been wrong in a way that would not leave him for a very long time. Near the back of the hangar, Major Jason Miller was still watching the cockpit of 880412, watching the woman who sat in it. He had stopped thinking about what he expected and was now simply observing what was in front of him. He had been in combat. He had made his own decisions under pressure. He did not believe that his own record was small or unimportant, but he recognized, looking at Emily Carter in that cockpit, something that he understood instinctively, even if he could not immediately put language to it. Some moments, some specific, irreducible human moments, are so complete in themselves that they change the scale of everything around them. This was one of those moments. And Miller, who had never been prone to dramatic gesture, made a quiet decision. When this was over, when she came down from that cockpit and the day moved forward into whatever came next, he would find a way to say what needed to be said. Not about the mission, about the choice. The specific, human, difficult, irreversible choice that she had made in the air alone, when nobody was watching, when there was no observer and no record and no guarantee of outcome. The choice to stay. Because that was what Nighthawk actually was. Not the skill, not the flight hours, not the record. The choice to stay in the dark in the fire when everything said leave. And the refusal, quiet, complete without ceremony, to abandon the person who needed her to stay. That was what was sitting in the cockpit of a destroyed fighter jet in Hangar 4. That was what Staff Sergeant Hayes had put his hands on and tried to send away. That was what the tower radio had named in 2 words for everyone on the flight line to hear. Nighthawk has the line. And for the first time since arriving on this base 14 months ago, Hayes understood what a call sign actually meant. It was not a label, it was not a nickname, it was a testimony. A compressed record of who a person had proven themselves to be in the specific moment when being anything less was the easier choice. He looked at the woman in the cockpit. He stood straighter, and he said nothing at all. Because some things do not need words. Some things only need the silence of someone finally fully understanding what they are looking at. In the cockpit of 880412, Captain Emily Carter sat with her hand resting on the seat behind her, the empty seat, the one that smelled faintly of smoke in flight gear, in the specific, unmistakable presence of someone who had been afraid and trusted her anyway. And she breathed. Just breathed. The way you breathe when the worst is behind you and you are still somehow here. Still here. Still breathing. And the aircraft around her, scarred, broken, grounded forever after what it had survived, was the only witness that had been with her for every second of it. She sat with it a little longer. She owed it that much. She came down from the cockpit at 07:48, not because anyone told her to, not because the hour Reynolds gave her had passed, but because somewhere in the silence of sitting in that front seat, with her hand resting against Ryan's empty chair, and the smell of burnt wiring still faint in the air around her, something had finished. Not healed, not resolved, but finished the way a breath finishes before another one begins. She climbed down the access ladder one rung at a time, and when her boots hit the hangar floor, she stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked. The investigators near the rear of the aircraft tracked her movement but said nothing. The maintenance engineers, who had been doing a remarkably convincing impression of people focused entirely on their work for the past hour and 40 minutes, did not look up. Staff Sergeant Hayes, still at the hangar entrance, stood aside before she reached him. He did not speak. She did not look at him, but she noticed. She noticed the way he moved, the difference between how he had stood when she arrived and how he stood now. The body carries what the mind is processing, and Hayes's body right now was carrying something heavy and quiet and necessary. She walked past him and into the morning air. Major Jason Miller fell into step beside her. Not close, not in the presumptuous way of someone attaching themselves to a moment they were not part of. He walked at a respectful distance, slightly behind her left shoulder, in the way that fighter pilots sometimes walk near each other when something real has happened and words are not the first thing required. Emily felt him there. She did not tell him to leave. They walked 50 meters before he spoke. "The debrief is scheduled for 1300, he said. "I know." Reynolds pushed it. "It was originally 0900. "I know that too." Miller was quiet for another 20 meters. "Brooks is awake," he said. As of an hour ago, he was asking the nursing staff questions about the aircraft. Emily's stride changed, not stop changed, a slight quickening, a shift in the angle of her shoulders. "What kind of questions?" "Whether it landed clean," Miller said. "Whether the gear held, whether the airframe was intact enough to assess what failed and what didn't." She almost made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Almost. "That sounds like him." They said he was angry that nobody would give him a straight answer. "They never do," she said. "He hates that. He always says the vague answer is worse than the bad answer." Miller nodded. "I got that impression from the nursing staff's tone." They reached the edge of the tarmac. Emily stopped. She looked out at the runway, the long, pale stretch of concrete where 880412 had touched down less than 20 hours ago, with one engine gone and control surfaces compromised, and a pilot who had been awake and under combat stress for 11 consecutive hours, holding everything together with the last functional portion of a system that had no business being functional at all. "You weren't on the ground when we landed," she said. It was not a question. "I was in the air," Miller said, "inbound from the northern range. Approach control told us to hold at Angels 12 while they cleared the runway." "For us." "For you." Emily looked at the runway. "What did it look like?" she asked. "From up there." Miller was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about how to answer honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer anything. "It looked like something that shouldn't have been possible," he said. "The thermal signature was wrong. The flight profile was wrong. Everything about the approach was wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when the pilot is making real-time corrections for systems that aren't there anymore." He paused. "I watched the whole approach. I didn't know who was flying. I didn't know the call sign yet. All I knew was that someone was hand-flying a Strike Eagle with catastrophic damage at night, and they were doing it with the kind of precision that you only have when you have completely stopped thinking about anything except the next 10 seconds. Emily said nothing. "That's a rare thing," Miller said. "I've been flying for 11 years. I've met maybe 3 people who can operate that way under that level of pressure." He stopped. Then more quietly, "You should know that what we watched from up there, it wasn't just impressive. It was something else. It was the kind of thing that changes how you think about what's possible." Emily turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "Brooks made it possible," she said. He was managing navigation on a backup system that was losing power the entire last 40 minutes. He was talking me through coordinates with a burned hand and pressure building in the cockpit and an injury to his shoulder that he didn't tell me about until we were over friendly airspace. He didn't tell you. He knew if he told me how bad it was, I might change the flight profile to get home faster. He knew faster meant lower. Lower meant more radar exposure. She held Miller's gaze. He made a calculation, the same way I made a calculation about the ejection seat. He decided that telling me the truth about his condition was less important than keeping us on the safest possible route home. Miller absorbed that. So you both made decisions for each other, he said. That's what a crew is, Emily said. And the way she said it was not a lesson. It was not a speech. It was a fact stated plainly from a place deep enough that it required no decoration. Miller stood with that for a moment. Then he said, I owe you an apology. Emily frowned slightly. For what? For not being on the ground, he said, when you landed, when you came through the perimeter. He looked at her steadily. The people who were here, they didn't know. That's not an excuse. But the pilots who saw the approach, who were in the air when you came in, we knew something significant had happened. We should have been on the ground by the time you walked onto the flight line. We should have been there. Emily studied him. Hayes did his job, she said. Hayes did his job the way a person does their job when they don't have the context they need, Miller said. That's a failure of communication. That's a failure of the system, not of Hayes specifically. He grabbed my arm. There was a pause. I know, Miller said. I'm not angry about it, Emily said. And the strange thing was, she meant it. He saw what he saw. He assessed what he assessed. He was wrong, but he wasn't wrong the way that counts. Miller looked at her. What's the way that counts? Emily was quiet for a moment. The morning was warming around them. Someone on the far end of the tarmac was running an engine check, the sound rising and falling in that familiar oscillation that anyone who has spent enough time on a flight line stops hearing and then at some point cannot imagine life without. Wrong the way that counts, she said finally, is when you see what's in front of you and you still make the wrong call. Hayes didn't see what was in front of him. That's different. She paused. That's fixable. Oh, Miller thought about that longer than she expected. You're easier on people than most senior officers I know, he said. I've been wrong, she said simply. Plenty. She looked at her watch, 8:01. The debrief was at 1300. The medical wing was expecting her. Ryan was awake and asking irritating questions about structural integrity to nurses who had no idea how to answer them, which meant he was specifically and completely himself, which meant he was going to be all right in the way that actually mattered. I need to go to the hospital, she said. I'll drive you, Miller said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I'd like to. She looked at him for a moment. There was something she was reading in him, the same instinct that she used in a cockpit, the constant low-level assessment of what was real and what was performance. Miller was not performing. He was a man who had watched something from 4,000 feet above the earth and had understood in the way that people who actually know what they're looking at understand what it had cost. All right, she said. They walked toward the vehicle bay. Behind them at the entrance to Hangar 4, Staff Sergeant Hayes watched them go. He had his radio in his hand. He had not called anything in. He had not filed any incident report yet. Those things would come, they were required, they were necessary, and he would complete them with the same attention to detail that he brought to everything. But right now at 08:01, on a morning that had already rearranged something inside him permanently, he watched Major Miller and Captain Carter walk toward the vehicle bay, and he thought about the specific unrecoverable second when he had grabbed her arm. The grip that had lasted less than 2 seconds before she dissolved it without effort. He could still feel the absence of it, the way his hand had found nothing where he expected resistance, the way the certainty had simply gone. He had been so sure. He was always sure, that was the thing. Hayes was good at his job precisely because he was decisive. He read situations quickly and acted on his assessments without hesitation, because hesitation in security work created gaps, and gaps created risk, and risk on a flight line with classified aircraft was not an abstract concern. But decisive was not the same as correct. He had been decisive and wrong. And the distance between those two things he was learning this morning was something that no amount of training fully prepared you for. He put the radio back in its holster. He would write the report. He would write it honestly the way he wrote everything. He would not soften what happened or frame it in language designed to make his judgment look better than it had been. He would write that he stopped an individual without authorization. He would write that he attempted physical contact. He would write that the tower corrected his assessment. He would write it clearly because the only way to learn from being wrong was to be honest about exactly how wrong you were. That was the decision he made standing at the entrance to Hangar 4 at 0802 on a Tuesday morning, watching the woman he had tried to remove from a flight line walk toward the base hospital to visit the man whose life depended on her refusing to leave him behind. At the base hospital, Ryan Brooks was in bed number 6 of the surgical recovery unit, and he was absolutely furious about it. Not about the bed, not about the nurses who were professional and efficient and had tolerated his questions with considerable patience. Not about the pain, which was significant and which he was managing with the specific tight-jawed stoicism of a man who considered expressing pain in front of strangers a personal failing. He was furious about the remote control for the television, which was out of reach on the tray to his right, and his right arm was immobilized from the shoulder surgery, and his left hand was bandaged from palm to mid-forearm, and the television was currently playing a morning program he had no interest in, at a volume slightly too low to hear clearly, and he could not do anything about any of it. He was also furious in a deeper and more significant way about the fact that nobody had told him anything real yet. Lieutenant Karen Osei, the nurse who had been managing Ryan's care since 0500, had developed a very complete picture of exactly how Captain Ryan Brooks processed medical situations. He processed them the way he processed everything, by demanding information, evaluating the information, identifying gaps in the information, and then demanding more information to fill the gaps. She imagined exactly how he operated in the air, and she respected it, but it also made her shift significantly more demanding than most. "Captain Brooks," she said, coming in with the 0800 medication, "I need you to stop trying to reach the remote." "I'm not trying to reach it," Ryan said. "I'm considering my options for reaching it." "Those are the same thing. Philosophically, they are distinct." Karen set the medication cup on the tray and moved the remote to the left side within reach of his less damaged hand. "There, now, stop planning things." Ryan looked at the remote. He looked at his left hand. He decided the television was not worth the effort and let it go. "Has anyone contacted Captain Carter?" he asked. Karen had answered this question 4 times since 0500. "I've passed along the message that you're awake and stable." "That's not what I asked. It's the answer I have." Ryan exhaled. It was the exhale of a man exercising a great deal of restraint. "The aircraft," he said, 880412, "has anyone told me whether the airframe, Captain Brooks? I just need to know if the gear held on landing." "You need to take your medication." "The gear is a structural question, not a medical one. If you could just check with..." "Captain." Ryan stopped. Karen looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had enormous respect for what he had survived and absolutely no patience for what he was currently doing. "The gear held," she said. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "How bad is the rest of it?" Karen picked up her tablet. "I don't have specifics on the aircraft. What I know is that it landed, it stopped, and Captain Carter walked off it under her own power. That is the extent of my aircraft knowledge, and also the extent of what I'm prepared to share about it." Ryan absorbed this. "She walked off under her own power," he said. "Yes. Before or after medical assessment?" "I believe before." Ryan nodded slowly, and the nod carried something complex in it, the specific understanding of a person who knew exactly why the person they were asking about would do exactly that, and the specific weight of knowing it was because of him. "She went to see the aircraft," he said. "Not a question." Karen said nothing. "Tell me she at least let someone look at her ribs first," he said. "Captain Brooks. Her ribs took a significant impact when the cockpit deformed." "I heard it. I need to know if she's been assessed." Karen paused. She looked at him. She made a judgment call, because sometimes judgment calls were what a good nurse made. "She is scheduled for a full medical assessment this morning," Karen said carefully. Ryan read the careful. "Scheduled," he said. "Yes." "Meaning not yet." "Meaning scheduled." Ryan closed his eyes. He breathed in once slowly through his nose. He breathed out the same way. "Of course," he said quietly. "Of course she went to the aircraft first." He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "How long were we in the air?" he said. Not to Karen specifically. To the question itself, the way people ask things they already know the answer to because saying it out loud confirms it. 11 hours and 43 minutes, a voice said from the doorway. Emily Carter stood in the doorframe. She was still wearing the borrowed clothes. She had not gone to the medical wing yet. She had come straight here from the tarmac. Miller was somewhere in the corridor behind her, giving her the space she needed, which she noted and appreciated without turning around. Ryan looked at her. The bruise on the left side of her face had deepened further in the morning light. The tremble in her hands was less visible than it had been on the flight line. She was holding herself very deliberately, which meant she was managing it, not that it was gone. Her eyes were the same eyes she'd had for the entire 11 hours and 43 minutes, which was to say they were the eyes of someone who had made hard decisions and lived with them and was still making them now. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She looked at him. His shoulder was immobilized. His left hand was wrapped in more bandaging than she had been told to expect. His face was pale in the specific way that comes from blood loss managed and corrected but not yet fully recovered from. There was a mark along his jaw. She hadn't known about that one from the cockpit deformation she had heard but not seen. "You look terrible," Ryan said. "So do you," Emily said. "I look legitimately terrible. I have excuses." "You think I don't have excuses?" "I think you haven't used any of yours yet." He paused. "How are your ribs?" "Fine." "Emily, they're managed." "That's not the same as fine. It's what I've got right now." Karen, professional to the last, quietly moved toward the door. "I'll give you some privacy. Captain Brooks, you have 30 minutes before I need to run your next assessment. Captain Carter, there is a medical team waiting for you at Wing 3 when you're ready." She left. The room got quieter in the way that rooms get quiet when the person managing the situation has removed themselves and the remaining people are left with the actual thing. Emily moved to the chair beside Ryan's bed. She sat down, slowly, because her ribs were not fine and she was not going to say so again. She sat down and she looked at him, and for a moment they were just two people in a room together, looking at each other and knowing what the other one knew, which was something that did not need to be organized into language to be understood. "The gear held," she said. "I heard." He paused. "The airframe. Significant damage? They're assessing structural integrity. The right engine is gone. Right horizontal stabilizer is partially gone. Forward fuselage shows. Can it be repaired?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. Ryan nodded. He looked at his wrapped hand. There was something in his expression that she knew, the expression of someone processing, not the medical situation, but the larger one. The one that contained the aircraft and the mission and the decisions and what came after. "I didn't tell you about my shoulder," he said. "I know. It was getting worse after the second hour. I should have told you. Protocol says," "Ryan, I made a unilateral decision about what information you needed without your—" "Ryan." He stopped. "You made the right call," she said. "You know you did. If I had known the extent of it, I would have altered the profile. We've already discussed this. I know we have, because we discussed it in the cockpit at 0330, somewhere over coordinates. I don't want to think about it again. And you told me your shoulder was fine, and I told you that if it wasn't fine, you needed to tell me, and you said it was fine, and here we are." Ryan looked at her. "You knew," he said. "I knew." "Since when?" "About the second hour," she said. "The way you were managing your right arm controls was different. The compensatory movement. You were favoring your left more than you should have been, and the only explanation was that your right shoulder was compromised." Ryan was quiet for a very long time. "You knew for 9 hours," he said, "and you didn't say anything. I knew that you knew what you were doing. I knew that you had made a decision, and I knew that whatever your decision was, it was the right one, because the navigation was clean the whole way, because you held the backup system together for 40 minutes on a hand that was burning." She met his eyes. "You made your call. I trusted it. That's what we do." Ryan looked at the ceiling again. There was something moving in his expression, not the pain, which was physical and separate, but something older and more central to the person he was. "I heard you," he said. "When we took the hit, I heard you say, 'Don't eject.'" Emily said nothing. "I heard you run the system check," he said. 3 seconds. "You ran a full system check in 3 seconds, and then you told me, 'Don't eject.' And I knew from the way you said it that the seat was compromised. I knew why you made the call." He stopped. I was not scared, he said carefully. I want you to know that. I was not afraid. I trusted you completely. Emily's hands in her lap tightened. But I also want you to know, Ryan continued, that for about 30 seconds after the hit, when the aircraft was in the attitude it was in, and the right engine was gone, and the systems were failing, I thought this was the end. I thought we were not going to make it. He turned his head and looked at her directly. And the reason I thought we were going to make it, the reason I stopped thinking we were going to die and started thinking we were going to survive, was you, specifically you. The way you had the aircraft, the way you were already working the problem. The way you sounded on the comms, he paused, completely calm. Emily looked at him. I wasn't calm, she said quietly. I know, he said. I know you weren't calm. That's not what I said. I said you sounded calm. I said you had the aircraft. And those things were true, even if the rest of it wasn't. She looked at her hands. I was terrified, she said. The word came out without armor. Just the word, just the truth of it. From the moment the missile hit to the moment the wheels touched the runway, I was the most afraid I have ever been in my life. Every second, every decision. I kept thinking about all the ways it could fail, all the calculations I could be getting wrong, all the systems I was asking to do things they weren't designed to do anymore. But you kept going, Ryan said. I kept going. That's the thing, Em. His voice dropped slightly into the register he used when he was saying something he meant without qualification. That's the only thing. Everybody's afraid. Fear is not the variable. The variable is what you do with it. She looked at him. In 3 years of flying together, 3 years of briefings and debriefs and long approaches and difficult weather and training exercises and the specific intimacy of spending hundreds of hours in a sealed cockpit with another person who knows your reactions before you do, she had not heard him say something that reached her quite the way that did. Not because it was a beautiful thing to say, because it was true. The debrief is at 1300, she said after a moment. I know. They told me I'm going to be assessed for remote participation. My physical presence is, he looked at his shoulder, logistically complicated. You're not going to let them do it without you. Of course not. You're going to argue with every person in that room who tries to characterize the navigation decisions. Absolutely. Even though you'll be doing it from a hospital bed on a screen with your arm in a sling. Especially because of that, Ryan said. It adds gravity. Emily made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh again, except this time it was slightly more a laugh than it had been on the tarmac. Ryan watched her. Go to the medical wing, he said. I'm going. Now, before the debrief. I said I'm going. Your ribs are not fine. Ryan, I know what fine sounds like when you're sitting down and taking shallow breaths because the deeper ones hurt, he said. I've been watching you breathe since you sat down. Go. She stood up, slowly, because her ribs were not fine and they both knew it. I'll see you at 1300, she said. Technically, you'll see me on a screen at 1300. I'll see you at 1300. She repeated the same way, and the way she said it communicated something that did not require elaboration. She walked to the door. Emily, she turned. Ryan was looking at her the way he had looked at her when she first appeared in the doorframe, the specific clear-eyed look of someone who has been through something real with someone else and knows exactly what that means. Thank you, he said, not for the mission, not for the aircraft, for the decision. For the specific, irreversible, calculated decision she had made at 40,000 feet in damaged airspace in the 3 seconds she had to make it when physics and procedure and the rational calculation all said something different, and she had overruled all of them. Emily held his gaze. Always, she said, one word, the same weight as everything. She walked out. Miller was in the corridor leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not looking at his phone or doing anything in particular, just present in the way he had been present on the tarmac, near enough to be useful, far enough to be respectful. He looked at her face when she came out. Medical wing, he said. Medical wing, she said. They walked. In the corridor, in the morning light that came through the windows in clean angles, Emily moved with the same control gait she had used on the flight line, the same gait she used in the cockpit, the gait of someone who had decided where they were going and was going there regardless of what it did. Miller walked beside her. Can I ask you something, he said. Probably. The ejection decision. Was it immediate? She thought about it. 3 seconds, she said. I ran the check, I got the result, I made the call. 3 seconds. 3 seconds is fast. 3 seconds is all there was. Did you second guess it after? Emily was quiet for a moment. They reached the end of the corridor and turned toward the wing where the medical team was waiting. Every second of the next 11 hours, she said. Every time a system failed that I needed. Every time I wasn't sure about the navigation. Every time his voice on the comms changed and I thought, what if I was wrong? What if this is wrong? She stopped walking. Miller stopped too. And then she said I would run the check again. In my head, the same check, same data, same result. She looked at him, and then I would keep flying. Miller looked at her for a long moment. That, he said quietly, is what flying is. She started walking again. The medical team met them at the Wing 3 entrance. There were 3 of them, and their expressions communicated a very polished version of "you have kept us waiting" without saying it, which Emily acknowledged with a nod that said she knew and was here now, and it was time. She let them take her inside. At the entrance to Wing 3, Miller stood for a moment. He thought about the approach he had watched from altitude last night. The thermal signature wrong. The flight profile wrong. The aircraft descending in the specific, controlled, impossible way of something being hand-flown by someone who had stopped thinking about anything except the next 10 seconds. He thought about the 3 seconds. The check. The result. The call. And then 11 hours of keeping a dying aircraft in the air because the calculation run once and checked again and again and again at every moment of doubt had said this was right. He turned and walked back toward the main operations building. He had a debrief to prepare for. And for the first time in a long time, he was not entirely sure that anything he had ever done in the air qualified as the most important thing he had to say in that room. The debrief began at 1300 exactly. Colonel Reynolds did not believe in starting late. In his 27 years of military service, he had observed that late starts communicated something specific, that the people running the meeting were not certain they were in control of it. Reynolds was always certain he was in control of a room, even when he wasn't, because the appearance of certainty bought you the seconds you needed to actually become certain. He stood at the head of the table in Conference Room B of the main operations building and looked at the people assembled. There were 9 of them in the room physically. 2 additional faces appeared on the screen mounted to the left wall. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Vance from the Advocate Office connecting from the Regional Command Headquarters 60 miles east, and Captain Ryan Brooks, who was in bed number 6 of the Surgical Recovery Unit, his right arm in a sling, his left hand partially wrapped, his expression communicating with perfect clarity that he intended to participate in this debrief with exactly the same level of involvement he would have brought if he were sitting at the table. Emily Carter sat third from Reynolds' left. She had been in the medical wing for 2 hours and 11 minutes before the debrief. The medical team had assessed 3 fractured ribs, not cracked, fractured, along with the hearing damage, the bruising, and the impact trauma to her left shoulder that she had not mentioned to anyone, including Ryan, because it was manageable and because mentioning it would have made the conversation about something she did not have the capacity to address in that moment. They had taped the ribs prescribed medication she was not currently taking because the medication blurred the edges of things and she needed the edges sharp, and told her she should not be in a debrief room for at least 72 hours. She was in the debrief room. Reynolds had not ordered her to be there. He had in fact sent a message at 11:45 suggesting she attend remotely as Ryan was doing. She had responded through Miller, who was serving as an informal relay, that she would be there in person. Reynolds had accepted this without further argument because he recognized a calculation that had already been made and completed. She was in the room because she needed to be in the room, because whatever was about to be said about the mission, about the decisions about the aircraft, about the 11 hours and 43 minutes, she was not going to hear it from the distance of a screen in a hospital bed. She was going to be present for it. She was going to look at the people asking the questions and let them look at her. That was not pride. That was accountability. Reynolds understood the difference. He opened the debrief at 1300. This session is being recorded for the official incident review, he said. Everyone in this room and participating remotely has been briefed on protocol. We are here to establish a factual account of the events of Mission Designation Iron Cross dated yesterday. We are not here to assign blame. We are not here to conduct a disciplinary review. We are here to understand what happened. He looked around the table. Captain Carter, we'll start with you. Emily had known this was coming. She had been preparing the account in her head since 0400 that morning in the quiet of the cockpit of 880412 in the space between the moment she climbed in and the moment Colonel Reynolds appeared at the base of the ladder. She had organized it the way she organized everything in the air, sequentially factually with the internal states included, because the internal states were part of the data, and leaving them out would have made the account incomplete. She began with the mission briefing at 1400 the previous day. She described the flight plan, the assigned corridor, the weather conditions at departure, the state of the aircraft at pre-flight inspection. She described the initial portion of the mission, the transit, the ingress, the target acquisition phase, the weapons release. She described it the way she had been trained to describe mission events, clearly in order without editorial. The room was very quiet while she spoke. And then she reached the moment, the missile impact. She described the sound first because the sound was the first data point before the instruments, before the systems, before anything she could verify externally. The specific wrong sound of something hitting the airframe from outside. The secondary sound of the right engine beginning its failure sequence. The change in the aircraft's attitude in the air. Not violent, not sudden, but wrong. The way things that have lost a portion of their structural integrity are wrong. A new kind of heaviness in the controls that told her before any display could tell her that something fundamental had changed. I ran the initial damage assessment, she said. I had partial instrument function. The right engine was non-functional. The right horizontal stabilizer was compromised. The right fuel system was isolated as a precaution. What was Captain Brooks's status at that point? Reynolds asked. He reported his status as operational. She kept her voice flat factual. I had reason to believe his right shoulder was injured. He did not confirm this. Across the room on the screen, Ryan's expression did not change. What was your next priority? Reynolds asked. Ejection assessment, Emily said. The room shifted. It was not a visible shift. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound. But something changed in the quality of the attention. Because ejection assessment was the phrase that preceded the decision everyone in the room had been waiting to get to. Walk us through that assessment, Reynolds said. Emily did. She described it the same way she had described everything else sequentially factually. The check of Ryan's ejection seat system, the partial response from the seat electronics, the trajectory analysis, altitude, speed, ground terrain, proximity to hostile radar coverage, wind conditions, the calculation of Ryan's physical state relative to the demands of a combat ejection in those conditions, the calculation of the seat's mechanical reliability based on the diagnostic response she had received. The seat was not fully functional, she said. Based on the diagnostic, I assessed a 40 to 60% probability of successful ejection sequence completion. Lieutenant Colonel Vance from her screen leaned forward. Captain Carter, I need to make sure I understand. You are saying that based on your assessment, there was a 40 to 60% chance of the seat functioning correctly. Correct. Which means there was also a 40 to 60% chance that the seat would fail. Correct, Vance made a note. And the alternative you chose was to hand fly a severely damaged aircraft through hostile airspace for how long? 11 hours and 43 minutes, Emily said. Vance looked at her for a moment. And you assessed that as the safer option. I assessed it as the option with the higher probability of Captain Brooks surviving, Emily said. Those aren't the same calculation. There was a pause. Reynolds said nothing. He was watching the room. Major Miller, seated 2 places to Emily's right, was watching her with the same expression he'd had on the tarmac. Focused, absorbing, understanding something in layers. Captain Carter, said Major Dennis Carver from the Operations Analysis Division, a man who had been taking notes continuously and had not looked up from his tablet in 10 minutes. The standard procedure in a situation where ejection is assessed as compromised is to contact base command for a second opinion before making the final determination. You did not do that. Emily looked at him. No, she said, I didn't. Can you explain why? Because the communication system was partially compromised. I had intermittent transmission. The window I had between the damage and the moment where the ejection decision needed to be made was approximately 3 seconds. Carver looked up from his tablet. 3 seconds. 3 seconds. You made the decision in 3 seconds. I made the decision in 3 seconds, Emily said. because 3 seconds was what there was. If I had waited for a communication window to open, the window for the decision would have closed. The aircraft would have continued descending. The options would have narrowed. She held his gaze. I made the call with the information I had and the time I had to make it. That is what the situation required. Carver looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who flew. He was a man who analyzed what flying people did, which was a different thing, and he knew it, and Emily could see that he knew it, and neither of them was going to pretend the gap between those two things was not there. Your decision deviated from standard procedure, he said. Yes, Emily said. You're aware that this review has to account for that deviation. I am. And you stand by the decision. Captain Brooks is in that hospital bed, Emily said quietly, and he's alive. So yes, I stand by it. Carver made a note. Reynolds looked at Ryan's face on the screen. Ryan was looking at Emily with the expression of a man who understood every word of what had just been said and could not have said it better himself and was aware that saying so would not help. He stayed quiet, which was Reynolds observed the most disciplined thing he had seen Ryan Brooks do in the 2 years he had known him. The debrief continued. For the next 40 minutes, Emily walked the room through the 11 hours and 43 minutes with the same precision and clarity she had brought to the beginning. The navigation. The system failures one by one in sequence, each one requiring a real-time adaptation that she described without drama in the specific language of someone who had already converted the experience into data, because converting it into data was the only way to process it while it was happening. The fuel management. The communication windows. The moments where the aircraft's behavior changed in ways that required immediate correction. She described the last 40 minutes separately. The backup navigation system was losing power, she said. Captain Brooks managed the system manually. He was providing coordinates verbally, reading from a degrading display, adjusting for the power fluctuation in real time. She paused. He did this for 40 consecutive minutes with an injured right shoulder and significant burns on his left hand. Miller beside her did not move. Reynolds at the head of the table did not move. The navigation was clean, Emily said. Every coordinate, every adjustment, clean. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up. I want that to be in the record. Whatever this review concludes about my decisions, I want it noted that Captain Brooks' performance during those 40 minutes was the most precise navigation work I have witnessed in my career. On the screen, Ryan's jaw tightened, not with emotion or not only with emotion, with the specific private tightening of someone who has been given something they did not expect and do not know immediately what to do with. Reynolds made the note himself. He wrote it by hand on paper, which he almost never did. Then Carver asked the question that changed the temperature of the room. Captain Carter, he said, I'm looking at the flight data recorder output from the final 40 minutes of the mission. The aircraft's recorded speed and altitude profile shows 2 separate instances where you had the opportunity to increase speed significantly, which would have reduced your time in hostile airspace. You maintained a lower speed profile. He looked at her. Why? Emily looked at him. The room was very still. Lower speed meant lower radar profile, she said. Lower speed meant longer flight time, but it also meant we were harder to detect on the remaining hostile radar coverage in the corridor. The analysis suggests the radar risk at higher speed was within acceptable parameters, Carver said. My assessment differed, Emily said. Based on what data? Based on the data I had in the cockpit, which did not match the post-mission analysis, because the post-mission analysis has information I did not have at the time. She kept her voice level. I made the decision on the information available to me. Carver nodded. He was not challenging her. She could see that. He was building the record. But the room had noticed something in the exchange, and the room was waiting to see if the next question was the one that changed direction. It was. Captain Carter, Carver said, and his voice shifted not dramatically but noticeably the way a person's voice shifts when they move from the prepared questions to the one they have been thinking about longer than the others. In your assessment, is there any universe in which the decision to not eject was influenced by something other than the tactical calculation? The room went completely silent. Reynolds looked at Carver. Miller looked at Carver. On the screen, Ryan went very still. And Emily Carter looked at Major Carver for a long moment before she answered. Yes, she said. Nobody moved. I have known Captain Brooks for 3 years, she said. He has been my weapons officer for all of those 3 years. He has trusted me with his life in that aircraft more times than I can count. The tactical calculation was real, and it was the primary basis for the decision. She stopped. She started again. But I would be lying, and this review deserves the truth, not the convenient version, if I said that knowing it was Ryan in that backseat had no bearing on how hard I was willing to work to make the calculation come out right. The room absorbed this. Carver made a note. Reynolds made a note. Miller made no note. He was looking at Emily with the expression of someone who has just been given an unexpected gift. Not something pleasant, but something true, which is the more valuable kind. You're saying, Carver said carefully, that the personal relationship affected the intensity of the effort, not the quality of the decision. I'm saying, Emily said, that the decision was correct. And I'm saying that the person in that seat was a reason I was not prepared to accept any outcome other than bringing him home. She paused. I think those two things can both be true. I think they have to both be true or the record is incomplete. Carver put his tablet down. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible. But Miller saw it and Reynolds saw it, and it meant something, the laying down of the instrument, the moment where the person taking notes stops taking notes and simply listens. The record will reflect both, Reynolds said quietly. The debrief moved forward, but something had shifted in the room. The quality of the questions changed. They became less procedural and more present. The people asking them had started listening differently, the way people listen when they have heard something real and are trying to understand it rather than categorize it. At 14:47, Reynolds called a recess. People moved. Coffee was refilled. The door to the corridor opened and closed. Miller stayed in his seat. Reynolds stayed at his place at the head of the table making notes. Carver stepped out. Emily sat still. On the screen, Ryan was talking quietly to someone off camera, a nurse probably. His voice was low and she couldn't hear what he was saying, but his expression had lost some of the controlled tightness it had carried through the early portion of the debrief. He looked for a moment like what he actually was, a man in a hospital bed recovering from injuries that were going to take months to fully understand, who was also at the same time a professional who had just given and received a complete account of one of the most significant events of his career. Emily watched him on the screen. He looked up and saw her watching. He said nothing. She said nothing. But something passed between them through a camera and a screen and 40 miles of fiber optic cable that was as clear and direct as anything that had passed between them in the cockpit of 880412 in the dark over hostile territory, with the aircraft failing around them and the coordinates coming through the comms in Ryan's careful, precise, injured voice. I was there, that look said. I know, hers answered. Reynolds' voice broke the moment. Captain Carter. She turned. Reynolds was not at the head of the table anymore. He had moved to the window, the one that looked out over the flight line, over the tarmac, where right now 880412 sat in Hangar 4, with investigators still working their way through its damaged systems and engineers still making notes about what had survived and what had not. I've been in command of this base for 4 years, Reynolds said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the window. I have read more debrief transcripts than I can count. I have reviewed incident reports for everything from minor mechanical failures to events that resulted in loss of life. He paused. What I have not often seen is a pilot give a debrief account that includes the full truth of every variable, including the ones that are harder to put in a report. Emily was quiet. That matters, Reynolds said. He turned from the window. Not because it changes the tactical assessment, not because it changes my recommendation to the review board, which will reflect that every decision you made was appropriate given the circumstances. He looked at her directly. It matters because this institution runs on the difference between what people say in these rooms and what actually happened. And when those two things match, when the account and the reality are the same thing, it means something. Emily held his gaze. Sir, she said, I just told the truth. I know, Reynolds said. That's what I'm talking about. The recess ended at 15:03. The room refilled. Carver came back with his tablet. The remaining panel members settled into their seats. On the screen, Ryan had shifted position, slightly leaning forward, which was costing him something in terms of his shoulder, but which he had clearly decided was worth it for the posture. Reynolds returned to his place. We're going to complete the debrief, he said. We have 2 remaining areas of focus, the communications log from the final 2 hours of the mission and the post-landing sequence. He looked at Emily. Captain Carter, before we continue, Is there anything you want to add to what you've provided so far? Emily thought for a moment. The aircraft, she said, 880412. I want it noted that the airframe held in ways it was not designed to hold. That is not pilot skill. That is the aircraft. Whoever designed the fault tolerance in that structural frame, whatever engineering decisions went into that aircraft's ability to sustain that level of damage and remain flyable, that is what made the mission survivable. I want that in the record. Reynolds looked at her. Carver made the note. On the screen, Ryan's expression did something brief and complicated and then settled. Noted, Reynolds said. The remaining portion of the debrief took 94 minutes. When it ended at 16:37, Reynolds closed the session formally and the room began to move. Chairs shifted, tablets were picked up. The screen connection to Lieutenant Colonel Vance closed with a small chime. Ryan's face remained on the screen. The room emptied around Emily until it was just her and Miller who had stayed, and Reynolds who had not yet moved, and Ryan's face on the screen across the room. Reynolds picked up his notes. I'll have the preliminary assessment to the review board by end of week, he said. Captain Carter, I expect you to remain in the medical wing tonight. Not a suggestion. Yes, sir, Emily said. Reynolds looked at the screen. Captain Brooks, well done. Ryan nodded. Thank you, sir. Reynolds left. The door closed. Miller stood up. He looked at Emily. He looked at the screen. He said to both of them without making it a speech or a statement, I've been in a lot of debrief rooms. I've never seen anyone give an account like that. He picked up his folder. For what it's worth. He left. Emily and Ryan were alone, or as alone as a person in a hospital bed and a person in a debrief room can be through a camera connection. Ryan spoke first. 3 fractured ribs, he said. She looked at him. Karen told me, he said, before the debrief, she said 3 fractured ribs, left shoulder impact trauma, bilateral hearing damage. He held her gaze. You sat in that room for 4 hours and 37 minutes with 3 fractured ribs and gave a perfect account. It wasn't perfect, Emily said. It was honest, Ryan said, which is better. She looked at her hands. The thing I said, she said, about you being in the seat, about it being Ryan specifically. I heard it. I wasn't sure if I should, Emily. His voice was quiet but absolute. I'm glad you said it. Not because it changes anything about the decision or the record or any of the official portions of this, because it's true, and because I would have said the same thing about you. He paused. If it had been the other way around, if I had been the one making the call, you think I would have made a different decision? She looked at him. No, she said. So, Ryan said, there it is. There it is. 3 words that contain the whole of it, the 3 years, the hundreds of hours, the briefings, and the debriefs, and the long approaches, and the difficult weather, and the specific irreplaceable knowledge of another person that you build only through time and trust and the willingness to be present for all of it. Emily stood up. Good. Her ribs registered the movement, and she managed it without changing her expression, which Ryan tracked and said nothing about, which was his form of respect for the management. I'm going back to the medical wing, she said. Good, he said. She moved toward the door. Emily. She stopped. The aircraft, Ryan said, 880412, you said the airframe held. It did. It held because of what you asked it to do, he said. You gave it the chance to hold. That was you. She looked at him for a moment. Get some sleep, she said. You first, he said. She walked out. The corridor was quiet in the late afternoon way of a military base that has been in motion since before dawn and is now letting the motion slow slightly, not because the work is done, but because the body of the institution has its own rhythms, and the afternoon is one of them. Miller was waiting in the corridor. Of course he was. I told you, Emily said, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, Miller said. She stopped arguing. They walked toward the medical wing in the quiet of late afternoon, and Miller did not say anything for the first 3 minutes, and Emily did not say anything either, and the silence was not uncomfortable, because it was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together. Not the same something, not by a long stretch, but something adjacent to each other. Something that touched, and who understand that the silence is part of it too. Then Miller said quietly, Carver's question. The one about whether personal relationship influenced the decision. What about it? Emily said. A lot of people would have said no, Miller said. Cleanly, officially, a lot of people would have given the tactical answer and left it there, And the record would have reflected that, and nobody would have known the difference. Emily walked. I would have known, she said. Miller nodded. They reached the entrance to the medical wing. For what it's worth, Miller said the same phrase he'd used in the debrief room, but different now, more specific. I've been flying for 11 years and I have never once sat in a debrief room and heard a pilot give an account that complete, that honest. He looked at her. It takes something to do that. Emily looked at the entrance. It takes less than people think, she said. It just requires deciding that the truth is worth more than the comfortable version. She pushed the door. Good night, Major. She went inside. Miller stood at the entrance for a moment. He thought about 11 years of flying. He thought about the accounts he had given in debrief rooms, the ones that were accurate and the ones that were accurate in the specific, careful way that left certain things unaddressed because certain things were complicated to address, and the outcome had been fine, and so the full truth had not seemed necessary. He thought about 3 seconds. The check, the result, the call. He thought about what it meant to make a decision like that, not just the tactical skill of it, not just the training that made it possible, but the specific human weight of knowing that the decision was yours, that nobody else was there, that the outcome was going to live inside you, regardless of whether it appeared in a report. He thought about what Emily Carter had said in that room. The decision was correct, and I was not prepared to accept any outcome other than bringing him home. Both true, simultaneously, without apology and without performance. He walked back toward the operations building. Behind him, the medical wing door closed. And in Hangar 4, in the still heat of the late afternoon, the damaged aircraft with the tail number 880412 sat with its scarred fuselage and its missing stabilizer and its burned engine housing and its intact cockpit surrounded by investigators who were doing the careful necessary work of understanding what it had survived. The aircraft could not answer their questions, but the woman who had flown it home could, and she had. In a conference room on the record with 3 fractured ribs and the full weight of everything she had carried through 11 hours and 43 minutes of darkness and fire and the specific human refusal to leave someone behind. She had told the complete truth, every variable, every calculation, every reason. And the record from that day forward would contain both the decision and what it had cost, not because it was required, but because she had decided it should, because that was what it meant to be accountable. Not just to the mission, to the truth of the mission. And there is no document, no official review, no formal recognition that carries more weight than that. The preliminary review board assessment arrived 3 days later. Reynolds received it at 0620 on a Thursday morning in his office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading it. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and sat with it for a few minutes before picking up the phone. He called Miller first. Not because protocol required it, because Miller had been in that debrief room and Reynolds trusted Miller's read on people in the way that senior officers sometimes trust the reads of people slightly junior to them who have demonstrated consistently sound judgment over time. The board completed their preliminary, Reynolds said when Miller picked up. Miller was quiet for a second. And every decision validated, Reynolds said. Ejection assessment, flight profile, navigation choices, communication management, all of it reviewed and confirmed as appropriate, given conditions. He paused. There is a commendation recommendation for both Carter and Brooks. It will go to regional command for final approval. Miller said nothing for a moment. Is that the part you called to tell me? He said. Reynolds looked at the assessment on his desk. There was a second document beneath it, a separate internal memo not part of the official review, flagged for his attention from the base legal office. He had read it once at 0618 and had been sitting with it since. There's a secondary item, Reynolds said, unrelated to the official review. Miller waited. Someone filed a formal complaint, Reynolds said, against Carter, specifically regarding her conduct on the flight line the morning after landing, the physical response to Staff Sergeant Hayes when he attempted to detain her. The line was quiet for 3 full seconds. Who filed it? Miller said. It came through the security division chain, Reynolds said. I don't have the originating name on this copy, but it characterizes her response to Hayes as an assault on a security officer in the performance of his duties. Miller said nothing. Reynolds could hear him breathing. How are you handling it? Miller said, and his voice had gone to a register that was very quiet and very specific. By the book, Reynolds said, which means it has to be reviewed, which means Carter has to be informed, which means he stopped, he started again, which means that before I tell her, I need to understand that exactly what happened from every angle, including Hayes. There was another pause. I was there, Miller said. I watched the whole thing. She didn't assault anyone. He grabbed her arm. She broke the grip. That was the totality of it. I know that, Reynolds said. That's not the issue. The issue is that it happened, it's documented, and the complaint exists, and I cannot make it go away by deciding it's inconvenient. When are you telling her? This morning, Reynolds said. I'd like you there. Tell me when and where, Miller said. Reynolds told him, then he hung up and looked at the window. The flight line was quiet in the early morning. Hangar 4 was still closed, the investigation ongoing. 880412 was still inside, still being examined, still giving up its data to the engineers who were trying to understand what it had survived. The preliminary structural report had come back the previous afternoon. The aircraft was beyond repair. The damage to the frame was too extensive, the cost of rebuilding it greater than the value of the platform it had been. 880412 was going to be decommissioned. Reynolds had not told Emily that yet either. He picked up the phone again. He had 2 calls to make before 700. One to the base legal office and one to the medical wing to confirm that Captain Carter was cleared for an out-of-facility meeting. He made them both. Emily was in the medical wing common room at 6:50 when Reynolds and Miller arrived together. She was dressed not a flight suit, civilian clothes she had been given by the base supply officer, who had apparently decided that the borrowed gray shirt was no longer appropriate, and she was sitting in a chair near the window with a cup of coffee that she was actually drinking, which Miller noted as a positive sign because the version of Emily Carter he had watched for the past 3 days was the version that forgot to eat and drink and sleep, and not out of drama, but out of the specific consuming focus of a person whose mind was still running the same calculations it had been running in the cockpit because the body comes home before the mind does. She saw them come in together and she knew immediately. Not the content, but the shape of it. 2 senior officers mourning together unscheduled. The shape of that was not good news. She put down the coffee. What happened? She said. Reynolds sat across from her. Miller stayed standing near the door in the specific way of someone who is present as a witness, not a participant. The preliminary review board assessment came through this morning, Reynolds said. All decisions validated. Commendation, recommendation for you and Brooks going to regional for approval. Emily waited, because that was not why they were here. There is a secondary matter, Reynolds said. A formal complaint has been filed regarding the flight line incident on Tuesday morning, specifically your physical response to Staff Sergeant Hayes. Emily looked at him without expression. Characterizing it as assault, Reynolds continued, on a security officer in the performance of his duties. The room was quiet. Emily looked at the window. She did not say anything for a moment, and the moment stretched in the specific way that moments stretch when a person is deciding how to respond to something that has made them angry in a way they are not going to show. I didn't assault him, she said. I know that, Reynolds said. He grabbed my arm. I broke the grip. That was the extent of it. I know, Reynolds said. Major Miller witnessed the exchange. His account will be part of the review. Emily looked at Miller. Miller met her gaze steadily. He said nothing. He had already said what he had to say to Reynolds, where it mattered. He was here for her now, not for the institutional piece of it. Who filed it? Emily asked. I don't have the originating name on the preliminary document, Reynolds said. Emily looked at him. But you have a reasonable idea, she said. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Captain Carter. Sir, she said, and her voice was very steady and very direct. I'm not asking for a name to do anything with it. I'm asking because I'd like to understand the full picture of what I'm dealing with. Reynolds looked at her. He made a judgment. The complaint came through the security division chain. That is the extent of what I can tell you at this point. Emily processed that. The security division chain, not Hayes. Hayes was too junior to originate a formal complaint that moved through channels fast enough to land on Reynolds' desk in 3 days. Someone above Hayes in the division chain had made a decision, a deliberate, considered decision to formalize what had happened on the flight line and put it on record in a way that would require official response. Someone who had not been there. Someone who had read a report. All right, Emily said. Reynolds looked at her carefully. That's your response. That's my response, she said. You're telling me there's a process and the process has to run. I understand that. I'll cooperate with whatever the review requires. She picked up her coffee. Is there anything else? Reynolds and Miller exchanged a look. There was something else. Reynolds set a second document on the table. Emily looked at it. It was a single page. The heading was from the Aircraft Structural Assessment Division. She did not need to read more than the first 2 lines. She set the coffee down again. They're decommissioning it, she said. Yes, Reynolds said. She looked at the document, the clinical language of engineering assessment, damage to primary load-bearing frame members, cost-benefit analysis, platform age and replacement timeline. The words that added up to the conclusion that 880412 was not coming back. When is the decision final, she said. It's already final, Reynolds said quietly. The assessment was completed yesterday. It goes to the decommissioning schedule as of this morning. Emily sat with that. The aircraft that had carried her through 11 hours and 43 minutes. The aircraft that had taken a missile hit and continued to fly. The aircraft that had held its structure together through everything she had asked of it. Everything it had no right to survive was going to be taken apart, documented, archived, filed under a reference number in a database somewhere. I'd like to be there, Emily said, when they do the final assessment, when the engineers complete their work and close the report. I'd like to be there for that. Reynolds looked at her. I'll arrange it, he said. There was a knock at the door of the common room. Miller turned. Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes was standing in the doorframe. He was in full uniform, his hands were at his sides. His expression was the expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is now in the moment of whether to actually do it. He looked at Reynolds first. Sir, I apologize for the interruption. I was told Captain Carter was here. He stopped. He started again. I needed to speak with her. I know the timing is... Hayes, Reynolds said. Hayes looked at him. Reynolds looked at Emily. Emily was watching Hayes with the same clear, direct attention she brought to everything. She had not moved. Her face had not changed. But something in the quality of her attention had shifted, not toward suspicion, not toward anger, but toward the specific alertness of someone who is reading a situation in real time and is genuinely uncertain what they are reading. Let him in, she said. Reynolds looked at her for a moment. Then he stood. Miller pushed off the wall. Reynolds and Miller left the room together. Miller pulled the door closed behind them. Hayes stood in the middle of the common room. Emily was still in her chair. She had not stood up. She was looking at him in the quiet, assessing way that she looked at everything that required her full attention. Hayes was 26 years old and he had walked into rooms under difficult circumstances before. He had dealt with hostile situations. He had managed people who were angry and frightened and unpredictable. That was the job. He had never walked into a room where he needed to say what he was about to say. I didn't file the complaint, he said. Emily said nothing. I want you to know that, Hayes said. I wrote my incident report honestly the way I write everything. I included what happened, what I did, what you did, the full sequence. I did not characterize your response as assault. I described it accurately. He paused. Someone above me in the division chain reviewed my report and made a different characterization. I found out this morning. His jaw was tight. I reported to my division supervisor immediately and told him that the characterization in the complaint did not reflect my account of the incident. Emily looked at him. Did that change anything? She said. Hayes met her gaze. I don't know yet, he said. I hope so. I told him the truth, what I said in my report and what I believe happened, and I told him that if the complaint moves forward in its current form, my account is on record as contradicting it. He stopped. I wanted you to hear that from me directly, before you heard anything else. Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the young man standing in the middle of the room, 26 years old, uniform, immaculate hands perfectly still at his sides, standing in a place he had clearly decided was the right place to be, even though it was not an easy place to be. Sit down, Sergeant, she said. Hayes sat, not at ease, not relaxed, but he sat in the chair across from her with the posture of someone ready to receive whatever came next. What did you tell your supervisor? Emily said. I told him that I stopped an individual on the flight line without proper identification or escort, that I attempted to physically detain her when she refused to comply, that she responded by breaking the physical contact without causing injury to me. That the tower then identified her as the pilot of aircraft 880412, at which point I stood down immediately. Hayes paused. I told him that in my professional assessment, her response was proportional defensive and did not constitute assault. Emily looked at him carefully. That's a significant thing to say in a formal statement against your own division chain, she said. Yes, ma'am, Hayes said. What made you do it? Hayes looked at his hands for a moment. The hands that had reached for her arm on the flight line 3 mornings ago. The hands that had found nothing where they expected resistance. I was wrong on the flight line, he said. I made a judgment call on incomplete information and I was wrong. I can live with being wrong. That's part of the bond, and you correct and move forward. He looked up. What I cannot do is let someone else's characterization of what I witnessed stand in the official record when I know the characterization isn't accurate. He paused. That would make me wrong twice. Wrong in the moment and then wrong about what the moment was. I'm not willing to be wrong twice about the same thing. Emily looked at him for a long time. The morning light came through the window. Somewhere down the corridor, the medical wing was going about its business, the sounds of a working facility measured and purposeful. The complaint may still move forward, Emily said. I know, Hayes said, even with your statement contradicting it. I know that too. And you filed the statement anyway. Yes, ma'am. Emily picked up her coffee. She looked at it for a second. She put it down. Hayes, she said, ma'am, what do you know about the mission? He looked slightly uncertain. What I've heard, what's circulated on the base, the aircraft, the damage, the return, he paused. The call sign. What do you know about Captain Brooke? That he's in the hospital, that he was injured during the mission, that he's recovering. Emily looked at the window. Ryan Brooks has been my weapons officer for 3 years, she said. He is the most precise navigator I have ever flown with. He is also one of the most stubborn, irritating, particular people I have ever met. And when he is wrong about something, he argues about it for so long that being right becomes almost not worth it. She paused. He is also the person who held a degrading navigation system together with a burned hand for 40 consecutive minutes in the dark over hostile territory so that I could keep flying. She looked at Hayes. That is who was in the back seat. That is who we are talking about when we talk about the decision I made on the flight line. Hayes was listening with his whole body. I am telling you this, Emily said, not because I want you to feel worse about what happened, but because I think you deserve to understand the full picture of what you're in the middle of. She met his eyes. You walked into this room this morning. You told me you did not file the complaint and that you contradicted it in your own statement. I believe you, and I think what you did took more integrity than most people in your position would have shown. Hayes looked at her. But you still grabbed my arm, she said. The words were level, not angry, just true. Yes, ma'am, he said. And that is something you are going to sit with, she said. Not because I need you to, because you need to. Not to punish yourself, that's not what I mean. But because the understanding of how wrong an assessment can be when you're certain when you have training and procedure behind you and you are still completely wrong, that is the most important thing you are going to carry out of this. She paused. That understanding is going to make you better at your job for the rest of your career. Better than any training exercise, better than any certification. Because you're going to remember this moment every time you reach for certainty, and you're going to ask yourself what you don't know yet. Hayes was very still. I'm not angry with you, Emily said. I want to be clear about that. I know, ma'am, he said. And then quietly, I'm not sure that makes it easier. Emily looked at him. No, she said. I don't imagine it does. Hayes stood. He straightened his uniform, a small instinctive gesture. Ma'am, he said, I want you to know what you did. The mission. What I've heard about it. He stopped. He tried again. I've been in security for 4 years. I've met a lot of people who come through these gates. I assess people for a living. He paused. I've never been as wrong about a person as I was about you, and I've never had that matter as much as it did. He stood for another second. That's all I wanted to say. He left. Emily sat in the chair after the door closed, and she looked at the window, and she was quiet for a minute. Then she picked up the coffee and finished it. Reynolds came back in at 0742. Miller was behind him. How did it go? Reynolds said. He's a good man, Emily said. He made a mistake and he's being honest about it, and he's going to be better for it. She set the cup down. The complaint should be reviewed honestly and dismissed honestly. Don't protect him from the process that wouldn't serve him. Reynolds looked at her. You're recommending we let the review proceed, he said. I'm recommending we let the truth proceed, she said, which is the same thing in this case. His account contradicts the characterization. Mine contradicts it. Miller's contradicts it. The review will close the right way. She stood up. That's all it needs to be. Reynolds absorbed that. Miller absorbed that. Neither of them said anything for a moment because sometimes the appropriate response to someone handling a situation with that level of clarity and composure is simply to let the handling stand. There's one more thing, Reynolds said. Emily looked at him. The commendation recommendation, he said. Regional command has moved quickly on it. Preliminary approval came through at 700. The formal ceremony, the presentation of the awards is being scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Emily nodded. There's a decision I need you to make, Reynolds said. The ceremony can be conducted formally, full squadron, attendance flight, line the complete protocol. Or it can be conducted privately in this office with relevant personnel only. He paused. That decision is yours. Emily thought about it. She thought about the flight line. The moment the radio said Nighthawk has the line, the pilots who had stopped moving, the silence that had settled over everything. She thought about what that silence had felt like. She thought about Ryan in bed number 6. His shoulder immobilized, his hand wrapped his expression when he'd told her that the reason he stopped believing they were going to die was her. She thought about Miller saying, I've been in a lot of debrief rooms. I've never seen anyone give an account like that. She thought about Hayes standing in the middle of this common room at 700 in the morning in full uniform, hands at his side, saying, I'm not willing to be wrong twice about the same thing. Full ceremony, she said. Reynolds looked at her. He had not expected that. You're sure, he said. Ryan deserves a full ceremony, she said. Whatever the commendation is, whatever recognition comes from this, it belongs to both of us, and it belongs in front of the squadron, not in an office. She paused. And I think the people on this base who didn't see what happened need to see something. She met Reynolds' eyes. Not because I need them to, because it matters that they understand. And ceremony is one of the ways this institution communicates what matters. Reynolds was quiet. Then he said 2 weeks from today. Full ceremony. He left. Miller stayed. He stayed because something had been building in him for the past 3 days, and it had reached the point where it needed to be said, not as a speech, not as a formal communication, but as one pilot to another. Can I ask you something, he said. You can ask me something, Emily said. The moment when you made the ejection decision, Miller said, 3 seconds, run the check, get the result, make the call. He looked at her. Was there a moment, a specific moment where you stopped being afraid? Emily looked at him. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. No, she said, never, never, she said. I was afraid for all 11 hours and 43 minutes. I was afraid when I made the call. I was afraid through every system failure. I was afraid on final approach when the gear came down and I didn't know if the frame was going to hold the landing. She paused. I was afraid when the wheel stopped and I knew we were on the ground and I had to decide whether to believe it was actually over. Miller looked at her. Then what kept you? He stopped. Flying, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The next 10 seconds, she said. Every time. Just the next 10 seconds. That's all I ever thought about. Not the full 11 hours, not the hostile territory, not all the ways the systems were failing. Just the next 10 seconds and what needed to happen in them. She looked at him. If you think about the whole thing, it's impossible. If you just think about the next 10 seconds, you can do it. You can always do the next 10 seconds. Miller stood with that, the next 10 seconds. He had been flying for 11 years, and he had never heard it put that simply, and he was aware with the particular awareness that comes when something true lands in you, that he was going to carry that for the rest of his career. Thank you, he said. For what? For that, he said simply. He left. Emily stood alone in the common room for a moment. The medical wing was going about its day around her. Somewhere down the hall, Ryan was probably asking someone about something they weren't technically supposed to tell him. Somewhere on the flight line, the engineers were finishing their work on 8, 80412, writing the final chapters of what it had survived. Somewhere in the security division, a complaint was moving through a process that would end the way it had to end. And 2 weeks from today, on a runway in the desert sun, something was going to happen that she had not asked for and had not sought, and that she had said yes to because it mattered that the people around her understood. Not that she was exceptional, that this was what it looked like. Not the legend, not the call sign, not the version that circulated through briefing rooms in the compressed, simplified language of stories told fast. The real thing. The fear in the next 10 seconds, and the choice to stay when leaving was easier, and the truth in a debrief room, and the young sergeant standing in a common room at 0700, because he had decided that being wrong twice about the same thing was something he was not willing to do. That was what it looked like, and she wanted them to see it. She walked back toward her room in the medical wing. Her ribs registered every step. She let them. The complaint was dismissed on a Friday, 11 days after the flight line. 8 days after Hayes walked into the medical wing common room and stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and said what he needed to say. 4 days before the ceremony. Reynolds told Emily by phone at 0815. He kept it brief because the result was what it was, and the documentation would follow, and there was nothing complicated to say about it. The review had received 3 independent accounts, Hayes' own report, Miller's witness statement, and Emily's account, and all 3 told the same story. The characterization in the original complaint did not survive contact with the facts. Emily said thank you and hung up. She sat on the edge of her hospital bed. She had been cleared to leave the medical wing 2 days earlier, but had agreed to 1 additional night for the rib monitoring because Reynolds had asked her to, and she had decided that agreeing to small things when people were trying to look after her was the least she could do, and she held the phone in her hand for a moment. She did not feel relieved exactly. She felt the absence of a weight she had been carrying for 11 days without fully acknowledging she was carrying it. That is its own kind of feeling, not joy, not celebration, just the specific quiet knowledge that something that could have gone wrong went right, and the space that opens up when you realize you can stop preparing for the version where it didn't. She set the phone down. She thought about Hayes. She had not spoken to him again since the morning in the common room. She had heard through Miller that Hayes had formally requested reassignment within the security division, not away from the base, not away from flight line duty, but to a different post-rotation, a different scope of responsibility. Miller had mentioned it in passing without editorial, and Emily had absorbed it the same way. She understood the request. Sometimes the right response to a significant error is not to leave the field, but to change your position within it. To say, I need to approach this from a different angle. I need to rebuild my understanding of this work from a place that is not contaminated by the certainty I had before. That was not weakness. That was the specific kind of self-knowledge that most people spend entire careers avoiding. She picked up her phone again and called Ryan. He answered on the second ring. Complaint dismissed, she said. I know, he said. Reynolds called me at 0810. He called you first. 5 minutes earlier. Apparently he thought I'd be more upset about it than you. Were you, more upset than you, Ryan said. Considerably, yes. You have a very unreasonable level of equanimity about things that should make you angry. I'm not angry. I know you're not angry. That's what I'm saying. You should be at least a little angry. Someone tried to put an assault charge on your record 3 days after you flew a dying aircraft home through enemy fire. Most people would be angry. Most people aren't dealing with fractured ribs, Emily said. Anger requires energy. There was a pause, and then Ryan made a sound that was the specific, reluctant sound of someone who has found something funny that they did not intend to find funny. How's the shoulder, she said. Better than yesterday, he said. Worse than I'm telling the doctors. The hand is actually improving faster than they expected. The burns are responding to treatment. He paused. The hearing assessment came back this morning. Emily went still. And, she said. Ryan was quiet for 1 second, and in that second, Emily's entire body did the thing it did when something important was suspended. Partial loss in the left ear, he said, 12%. They say it's unlikely to improve beyond where it is now, but it's within the threshold for continued flight duty. He paused. Pending further evaluation. Emily breathed. That's the honest answer, Ryan said. They're not clearing me to fly yet. They're saying the permanent loss is within the threshold. There's a difference. But you could still fly, Emily said. They are not saying I cannot fly, Ryan said carefully. What they are saying is that we're going to do another assessment in 8 weeks and make that determination then. Ryan, Emily, are you going to be able to fly? Another pause. I'm going to be able to fly, he said. Quietly, certainly, with the specific tone of someone who has already decided something and is simply informing the other person of a decision that is not a wish but a fact they are working toward. Emily let out a breath she had been holding without knowing it. Good, she said. Agreed, Ryan said. Now tell me about the ceremony. Reynolds said you requested full squadron attendance. I did. Why, Brian? Because you deserve it, as she said to Carter. Because we both deserve it, as she said. And because I want every person on that base to see what this actually looks like. Not the version they heard about, the real version. Ryan was quiet. What does the real version look like, he said. You in a sling, as she said. Me with taped ribs. Both of us standing on a runway, getting a commendation we earned the hardest possible way. She paused. That's what it looks like, and that's what they should see. Ryan was quiet for a moment longer. All right, he said. Full ceremony. 4 days, she said. I'll be there, he said. I have already told the medical staff that I will be physically present at the ceremony, and that this is not a request. So, how did they respond? With the faces of people who have been working with me for 11 days and understand that arguing with me about this specific issue is not a productive use of their time. Emily almost smiled. Get some rest, she said. You first, he said. She hung up. The next 4 days moved in the specific way that days move when something significant is coming, and the waiting is not idle. It is charged full of small moments that feel larger than they would otherwise because everything is happening against the backdrop of the thing ahead. On the first of the 4 days, Reynolds held a closed meeting with the senior officers of the base, including Miller, to finalize the ceremony details. He did this with his characteristic precision, moving through the logistical items efficiently and without ceremony about the ceremony, which was the way Reynolds operated. He treated the planning of meaningful events with the same focused practicality he brought to operational planning, because in his view, the best tribute to something significant was to prepare for it properly. On the second day, Emily walked the flight line, alone. At 06:30, before most of the base was in full motion, she walked the length of it from the main apron to the far end near the navigation aids, and then back, and her ribs registered every step, and she let them, because the physical reality of it, the pain, the effort, the deliberate choosing to be present in a body that had been through what hers had been through, felt important. She did not know exactly why. She did not try to analyze it. She just walked in the early morning on the runway that 880412 had touched down on 11 days ago. When she reached Hangar 4 on her way back, she stopped. The hangar doors were open. The engineers had finished their work. 880412 was alone inside. The investigators' equipment was gone. The maintenance carts were gone. The tablets and lights and extension cords were gone. Just the aircraft in the space that had held it since it came home, looking like what it was, a machine that had survived something. It wasn't designed to survive and would not be asked to survive again. Emily walked in. She stood beside the aircraft. She put her hand flat against the fuselage the same way she had on the morning after landing. The metal was cooler this time. The hangar had been aired out. The faint smell of burnt wiring was still there, but fainter, dissipating into the larger smell of aviation fuel and concrete and the particular dry air of the desert. She stood with her hand on the aircraft. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the aircraft did not already know, because it had been there for all of it, every second, every decision, every moment where the instruments were wrong and the systems were failing, and the only thing that kept the whole thing from ending was the combination of her and Ryan and the specific stubborn structural integrity of this machine. She stood there for a long time. Then she took her hand away. She walked out of this hangar and back toward the main building, and she did not look back. On the third day, Hayes found her in the corridor outside the operations building at 11:40. He was not in uniform. He was off shift in civilian clothes, which made him look younger than he did on duty, and he was carrying a cup of coffee in each hand, which made him look slightly uncertain about whether showing up had been a good idea. Captain Carter, he said. Sergeant Hayes, she said. He looked at the two cups. He held one out. I heard you were. He stopped. I brought coffee. I don't know if you drink coffee. I should have asked. I drink coffee, Emily said. She took the cup. He stood there for a moment with his own cup and his civilian clothes and his young face that was doing the particular work of a person who has something to say and is working out the exact architecture of saying it. I heard the complaint was dismissed, and he said. Yes, she said. I wanted to say, he stopped. I wanted to make sure you knew that I've been thinking about what you said. In the medical wing, about carrying this. He looked at her. About the understanding of being wrong, being more valuable than the embarrassment of it. I remember what I said, Emily said. I've been in security for 4 years, Hayes said. I'm good at this job. I genuinely am good at it. I read people well and I respond quickly, and my judgment is usually. He stopped himself. My judgment is often correct. He corrected it deliberately. But I have been thinking since that morning about all the times I was certain, all the times I made a call fast and was sure I was right. He looked at his coffee and wondering how many times the certainty was doing work that actual information should have been doing. Emily looked at him. That is the most important question you can ask, she said. I know, he said. I know that now. He looked up. I requested a transfer within the division. Different post. He thought about how to say it. I needed to approach this work from a place where I wasn't standing on the same ground where the mistake happened. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense, she said. A lot of people told me I shouldn't do that, he said, that it looked like I was running from it. Are you? She said. Hayes thought about it honestly, the way he was learning to think about things. No, he said. I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to put myself in a position where I can do this work better. Without the specific confidence of the how, where I already know the rhythms and the patterns and the way things usually go. He paused. Because the way things usually go is how certainty gets built, and certainty is what blinded me. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Where are you transferring me, sir? She said. Training division, he said. Security protocols instruction. I asked for it specifically. He paused. I want to teach the next group of security personnel something I didn't know when I started. About the gap between certainty and accuracy. About what you miss when you stop asking what you don't know yet. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. I thought about what you said. That carrying this was going to make me better. And I decided I wanted to pass that forward. Before I make another mistake. Before someone else starts 4 years of certainty without that lesson in it. Emily was very still. She was looking at Hayes with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something that occurs when a person does something that exceeds what you expected, not because the expectation was low, but because the action was simply that complete. That is an excellent decision, she said. I hope so, Hayes said. He looked at his coffee. I also wanted to say, oh. He stopped. He went again. The ceremony is in 3 days. I know I'm not assigned to flight line security that day. I won't be there in any official capacity. He met her eyes. I'd like to be there anyway, if it would be all right. Emily looked at him. You can be there, she said. Hayes nodded. Something in his face eased slightly. Not relaxed, eased in the specific way that people ease when they have been carrying a tension long enough that its release is something they almost have to get used to. Thank you, ma'am, he said. He left. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment with the coffee cup in her hand. She thought about 26-year-old Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes, who had made a significant error and had stood in it and had decided deliberately and with clear eyes to turn it into the most important professional lesson of his career and then dedicate himself to passing it forward. She thought about what that took. Not the error. Errors happen. Errors are part of the job. Part of every job, part of being human in situations that require quick decisions with incomplete information. The error was not the remarkable thing. The remarkable thing was what he was doing with it. The day of the ceremony arrived on a Tuesday. It was 0900 when the squadron assembled on the main runway. Emily was in her flight suit. It was the first time she had worn it since before the mission, since the borrowed clothes, since the medical wing, since the long days of debriefs and complaints and reviews, and all the institutional machinery that surrounds a significant event and processes it into documentation. The flight suit felt different than she remembered, not physically, but in the way that familiar things sometimes feel different when enough has changed inside you to make you notice what you always wore without noticing. Ryan was there. He had arrived in a vehicle from the hospital which he had fought until the medical staff agreed to the compromise that he would ride rather than walk the quarter-mile from the medical wing. His right arm was still immobilized. His left hand was partially wrapped. He was standing, not sitting, not in a wheelchair, standing because he had made that determination himself, and nobody who knew him well had been particularly surprised by it. He stood beside Emily. They did not speak. They had said what needed to be said in the 11 days between the mission and this moment. They had said it in the cockpit, on the comms, in the hospital room, over the phone, in the silence of two people who have been through something real together and know that silence is also a form of communication. They stood beside each other. The squadron was in formation in front of them, 43 pilots, every one of them in uniform, every one of them standing without movement in the particular stillness of a military formation that is not performing stillness, but is actually still because something is happening that is worth being still for. Reynolds stood at the front. To his left, Miller. To Miller's left, the rest of the senior staff. Behind the formation near the edge of the runway, Hayes stood in his civilian clothes. He had come as he said he would. He stood quietly at the back, hands at his sides, the same posture he had carried into the common room. He was not there to be seen. He was there to see. Reynolds began. He did not speak for long. That was not his style, and it was not the moment for length. The moment was for specificity, for the precise actual language of what had happened and what it meant without inflation, without the kind of language that turns real things into monuments, and in doing so removes from them the very quality that made them significant. He described the mission. He described it in the plain language of a military briefing: the objective, the aircraft, the damage, the decision sequence, the return. He described Ryan's navigation work in the specific concrete terms that the debrief record contained: 40 consecutive minutes degrading system, burned hand coordinate by coordinate clean. He described Emily's flight profile with the same factual precision. Then he stopped describing. He looked at the formation. I have been in command of this base for 4 years, he said. In that time, I have stood on this runway for ceremonies that marked achievement and ceremonies that marked loss. I have given commendations for excellence that was measurable and for courage that was not. He paused. What I have not before been asked to do is give recognition for something that resists the language of recognition, because what happened on Mission Iron Cross was not a spectacular performance. It was not a moment of brilliance. It was something quieter and harder and more human than that. The formation was absolutely still. It was a decision, Reynolds said, made in 3 seconds in the dark in a damaged aircraft over hostile territory by a pilot who had the information, the training, and the specific personal knowledge of the person beside her, and who chose deliberately, consciously, at full personal risk to stay. He let that word sit, to stay, when every system, every procedure, every rational calculation could have been read as permission to go. He looked at Emily. That choice is what we are recognizing today. Not the skill, not the record, the choice. He turned to the commendation. He read it clearly and completely as protocol required, the formal language, the designations, the official record of what the review board had determined and regional command had approved. He read it for Emily and he read it for Ryan separately and fully because both records needed to exist in their complete form. And then he did something that was not protocol. He stepped forward, not to present the commendation. He had already done that. He stepped forward in the specific, unscripted way of a person who has something to say that exists outside the formal record and has decided it needs to be said here in front of these people on this runway in the same air that 880412 had come home through. 11 days ago, Reynolds said, a staff sergeant on this base encountered a woman on the flight line and made a judgment call. The judgment was wrong. The woman he tried to remove from a restricted area was the pilot who had brought that aircraft home the night before. The tower identified her by her call sign, and everyone on this flight line stopped. The formation was so still that Emily could hear the wind. I want every person in this formation to sit with that moment, Reynolds said. Not because the staff sergeant was a bad officer, he was not. He was doing his job with the information he had. But because that moment, that specific moment where the radio said NIGHTHAWK and everyone stopped that moment, tells us something about how we see people, he paused. We see the clothes, we see the bruises, we see the missing ID and the wrong shoes and the exhausted hands, and we make a call. His voice stayed level and clear and completely without anger. And sometimes we are completely entirely wrong. And the person we have judged, the person we have tried to remove, is the person we should have been recognizing all along. Nobody moved. That lesson, Reynolds said, is worth more than any ceremony. It is worth more than any commendation, because it applies every day on this base and off it in uniform and out of it. The way we see people, the way we decide who belongs and who doesn't, what we assume when someone doesn't look the way we expect them to look. He looked out over the formation. Captain Carter did not ask to be a lesson. She asked to see her aircraft, but she has given us one anyway. And we would be failing her and ourselves if we walked off this runway today without having actually received it. The silence held for several seconds. Then Reynolds looked at Miller. Miller nodded once. And Major Jason Miller, 11 years of flight hours, a record that he wore quietly because he had seen what the alternative looked like, stepped forward and removed his helmet. He held it at his side. He looked at Emily, and he saluted. Not the formal salute of ceremony, the specific individual chosen salute of one pilot to another, of someone who has understood something clearly and is expressing that understanding in the only language that carries the full weight of it. The formation moved, one by one, 43 pilots. They did not move in unison. They did not do it on a command. They did it the way people do things when they have actually felt something, each person in their own moment, their own decision, their own specific recognition of what was in front of them. 43 salutes. Emily stood and received them. Her ribs hurt. Her shoulder hurt. Her left ear had been carrying a low, persistent sound since the mission that the doctor said might or might not resolve over time. She was standing on a runway in a flight suit on a Tuesday morning, where she was receiving salutes from people who 4 days ago had not known her name, and she was not performing composure. She was just present. That was the whole of it. Present in the body that had made it home on the runway that had held when the aircraft touched down in the air of a base that now knew what it had in it because she had shown them. Ryan stood beside her, his shoulder immobilized, his hand wrapped, his face carrying everything the 11 days had cost him, and the specific private look of someone who knows exactly what is happening around them and is grateful, not sentimentally, not publicly, but in the deep and quiet way that people are grateful when they are alive and know why they are alive and who helped them get there. He did not salute. He could not fully execute it. His arm would not allow it. But he turned to Emily. And he said, quietly enough that only she heard, "Told you they'd see it." She looked at him. "You told me nothing of the sort," she said. "I thought it very loudly," he said. She almost smiled. Then she did smile. At the back of the formation, Hayes stood in his civilian clothes with his hands at his sides. He did not salute. That was not his place today. He was not there as security. He was not there as a formal participant. He was there as a person who had made an error and understood it and was determined to carry the understanding forward, and who had decided that being present for this moment was part of how you honor what you've learned. He watched the 43 salutes. He watched Emily standing in the middle of them, not tall with pride, not diminished with emotion, but simply present the way she had been present on the flight line in the hangar, in the debrief room, in the common room. Present, complete, and entirely herself. He thought about the morning he had grabbed her arm. He thought about the second the certainty had dissolved. He thought about what Reynolds had said. The way we see people, what we assume, who we decide belongs. He thought about standing in front of new security personnel in a training room in a few weeks' time and starting a class not with procedure, but with a question. Tell me about a time you were certain. Tell me about what you assumed. Tell me about the gap between what you saw and what was true. He was going to tell them this story, not as a lesson about a pilot, as a lesson about a moment, a specific, ordinary, unremarkable-looking moment on a flight line where a person with training and authority and genuine commitment to doing his job correctly looked at another person and saw completely the wrong thing, and what it cost, and what it taught. He was going to tell it honestly, because the only way to pass forward the understanding of an error is to tell the truth about it, and Hayes had decided in the common room on the runway, in every moment of the 11 days between, that telling the truth was the only version of this he was willing to be. The ceremony ended the way ceremonies end formally, with Reynolds speaking the closing words, the formation breaking the movement of people who have been still returning to the ordinary business of a working base. But something had changed, not in the procedures, not in the regulations, not in the official documentation, which would say what it said in the precise language that official documentation uses. Something had changed in the way the people on that base understood themselves, what they were part of, what was in them, what it looked like when someone they might have overlooked, someone who arrived exhausted and injured and wearing borrowed clothes and couldn't produce an ID, turned out to be carrying something that no document could convey and no uniform could display and no ceremony could fully contain. The thing itself, the real thing, the choice made at 40,000 feet in the dark, and the 11 hours that followed it, and the truth told in a conference room, and the quiet conversation in a common room, and the hand against the scarred fuselage in an empty hangar. Emily walked off the runway. Miller fell in beside her the way he had on the tarmac 11 days ago, at a respectful distance, slightly behind her left shoulder. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They walked. After a moment, she said, "The next 10 seconds. Miller nodded. "Always," and he said. Ryan caught up to them at the edge of the runway, moving carefully with his immobilized shoulder, and the particular determination of a man who had decided that pace was a suggestion, and he was choosing not to take it. "If either of you are thinking about getting food," he said, "I want it noted that I have been eating hospital meals for 11 days, and I am prepared to describe the experience at length if that is what it takes to motivate a better option." Emily looked at him. "You have one working hand," she said. "I have one working hand and an excellent memory of how menus function," Ryan said. "These are not mutually exclusive." Miller looked between them. "There's a diner," I said, 10 minutes from the gate. "Good coffee, better food than anything on base." "Done," Ryan said, with the speed of someone who had already decided. Emily looked at Miller. Miller looked at Emily. "Done," she said. They walked toward the gate. 3 people. A pilot with taped ribs and a commendation in her pocket and a hand that was still learning to stop trembling. A weapons officer with one arm in a sling, and hearing that would take months to fully understand, and the clean navigation work of 40 consecutive minutes already in the record where it belonged. A senior pilot who had watched something from 4,000 feet above the earth and had been changed by it in ways he was still discovering. Walking toward a diner. 10 minutes from the gate, in the ordinary morning of a Tuesday on the other side of the extraordinary. Behind them, the runway. Behind the runway, Hangar 4. Inside Hangar 4, in the quiet and after the ceremony, Aircraft 8. 80412 sat in the last days of its existence as a flyable machine, or what had been a flyable machine in the hands of someone who refused to let it stop being one long enough to bring it home. It would be decommissioned. It would be documented, archived, recorded. But the record would say something permanent about it now, about what it carried, about what was asked of it and what it gave. And that record would outlast everything. The commendation, the ceremony, the careers of everyone who stood on that runway. Because that is what truth does when it is told completely and honestly and without the comfortable shortcuts that make it easier to say but smaller than it actually is. It stays. Long after the people who lived it have moved forward into whatever comes next, the truth of what happened stays exactly where it was placed in the record in the people who received it, in the young security instructor who was going to stand in front of a room full of new personnel and tell them the story of the morning. He grabbed a pilot's arm on the flight line and found out in the space of one radio transmission exactly how wrong certainty can make you. Captain Emily Carter did not consider herself a legend. She had never considered herself a legend. She considered herself a pilot who had made a calculation and held a dying aircraft together and told the truth about it afterward, and then walked back out into the ordinary world and kept going. That was the whole of it. And the whole of it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.